Tens of thousands of Australians took to the streets to protest this week against Australia Day. That marks the arrival of European colonists more than 200 years ago. The public holiday is held every January 26th every year. For most Australians, it means a day off work, a barbecue and some test match cricket. But for others, it's contentious. They say the date marks the arrival of Europeans who heralded the start of a centuries-long campaign of cultural genocide. Joining me to discuss this from Sydney, please welcome columnist for The Spectator, Alexandra Marshall. Hello, Alexandra. Now, can you quickly sum up what the issues are here?
Well, our problem is that Australia Day is loved and celebrated by the vast majority of Australian citizens, and it has always been the case. Most people consider Australia Day to be a lot of fun. We go out, we celebrate, we have all these activities on the harbour if you're in Sydney. It's a wonderful time. And I was down in Sydney Harbour dressed essentially as a walking Australian flag. It was great fun. We had all the tourists were there. It was a wonderful event. But if you go to Melbourne, an extremely left-wing enclave down there, we have the usual group of Marxist Indigenous activists, which is a tiny minority, backed up by the university class who pick up any protest banner they can find, cheered on by the Labor and Green MPs and senators who are looking for relevance in race politics. But the bulk of the people who marched down in Melbourne were not Australians. They were the same people who picked up the Palestinian flag and marched through our streets, who marched through your streets and shout things like destroy the state, the colonies must fall, this kind of thing. That's why they were holding Palestinian flags in one hand and Aboriginal flags in the other. If you looked at that crowd, they were majority the same people as the Palestinian protests we had there last weekend.
Isn't there an interesting thing, though, where a lot of Indigenous cultures support Israel? I know that in New Zealand you have the Maoris constantly doing the haka, and is that the same with the Aborigines? Because Jews are indigenous to Israel.
Well, we don't really have polls like that in Australia, or at least our press won't cover it, so we can't really tell you. What we do know is that the last referendum we had only at the end of last year, the majority of Indigenous people voted with the majority of Australian people to reject race politics in general. So this movement of separatism, this movement that hates Australia and wants to destroy the state, is a minority movement being backed up by the million-odd people we import every year who have no affiliation with Australia and are there waving foreign nation flags, who support mainly the Marxist movement, not an Australian movement.
So this is a left-right issue. I guess that also reflects slightly a young-old issue as well. But it's not about the political parties per se?
Well, Labor doesn't seem to mind bringing in socialism and Marxism by any means possible. They are playing somewhat of a Ponzi scheme with immigration in Australia at the moment. So they ignore some of the terrible things. Like, we had people shouting gas to Jews on the street, and our politicians did and said almost nothing. And just before Australia Day, we had our statues and monuments being attacked. We've got a photograph there on the screen. And we've heard nothing from the Labor Premier in Victoria about this after the first press conference. We've had no follow-up from Prime Minister Albanese about this. Instead, they made sure they arrested that one bloke who wrote Happy Australia Day on the side of a Coles shopping centre. That's the guy they went after, not the people who filmed themselves destroying our statues of Captain Cook and these monuments, which appear to be the same person. And these were all reblogged by large accounts on social media who were Free Palestine accounts. So it's all caught up in this modern movement. Just like with Black Lives Matter, when you had that going on, the Free Palestine movement is stirring up the tiny group of BLAK self-named activists that we have here in Australia.
So roughly how split is the country? You said it's the Melbourne-Sydney split, but how is that reflected? Is it extreme minority who are pushing this, destroying the statues, protesting, or is the feeling larger than that?
Well, over the last, 2 or 3 decades, the Marxist Indigenous activist group, and it is a minority, has not really changed much in size. They've been bulked up by some of the new universities. Students who, as you know, they like the Just Stop Oil, the climate change protesters, they pick up any protest they can. But the core group hasn't changed, and certainly the Australian demographic hasn't changed on this issue. What we have done is imported an enormous volume of people who do not have any interest in Australia, her history, her laws, her people or her culture, and they like any activity that destroys or changes the way people feel about the state. And you have it on your streets in the UK just as we have. The only difference is that we had Australia Day and they used that to hurt us, whereas you had the last war memorial service. They use that in your case. They use anything they can that has a national cultural significance to our nation. They tag onto that and they try and use it to divide the nation.
So you mentioned the sort of moral cowardice or silence of your political leaders. How had these protests been received in the wider society? Because I know within the UK, I truly believe that there is a silent majority who sees people with these flags calling for genocide in Israel of Jews. But, you know, you have your own flags, your own posters. Is there a silent majority there who's just sick of this, who's had enough?
Well, we saw that in the referendum. I mean, the referendum, they told us, was overwhelming support for racial issues and for establishing a racial bureaucracy inside Australia. Every single state and territory except for Canberra, which is our political centre, said no. So, and it was not just a slight no, it was a no, we don't want that at all. Since they did things like destroy the Captain Cook statue and say things like the colonies will fall, cook the colonies, things like that, the response on social media has been a complete change. Anyone who had lingering sympathies for things like the Palestinian cause has now lost all sympathy because of the way they are treating our history. Because let's not forget, Australia is one of the most peaceful histories in human history. Every single nation has its problems, but Australia, comparatively to the rest of the world, is a lesson in freedom and democracy, peace and prosperity. And so to be called all these horrible things by people who just arrived and who are standing aside and holding the flag of a terrorist state and saying, we like this better than Australia, Australian citizens have had enough of it, quite frankly.
Fair enough. Well, I think UK citizens feel the same way. Alexandra Marshall, thank you so much for joining us. When you do next come on, could you please wear your Australian flag outfit? That would be appreciated.
I will do my best.
Good, very good. OK, thank you very much there.